Dust of the last skirmish settled on the Martian plain, tasting of crushed rock and spent plasma. Kalen stood amidst the wreckage, the metallic tang a familiar companion now. Victory had been secured, but the cost gnawed at him, a dull ache beneath the adrenaline. They had taken the supply depot, vital for the next push, but the stratagem had required a feint, a deliberate sacrifice of a forward unit to draw enemy fire. He had given the order. He remembered the faces of the soldiers in that unit, young, eager, believing in the cause he had preached. Justice, freedom, a better solar system. Those words felt hollow now, like echoes in an empty chamber. The war wasn't fought with ideals, it was fought with bodies, with blood, with cold calculations of acceptable losses. And his definition of acceptable was expanding with every brutal victory. Earlier in the campaign, he would have found another way, sought a path with less human cost. But the enemy, particularly Varkos's relentless legions and the mercenary hordes Kino had unleashed, understood only overwhelming force and utter ruthlessness. To hesitate, to cling to outdated notions of chivalry or mercy, was to court annihilation for his entire movement. He had authorized the use of atmospheric disruptors on a defended orbital platform, knowing full well the non-combatants in the lower levels would suffer. The intelligence had been clear. The platform was a critical nexus for enemy communications and supply lines. Taking it quickly saved lives in the long run, his advisors argued. The screams that had briefly crackled over intercepted frequencies before the signal died haunted his infrequent moments of rest. The faces of his lieutenants watched him, their expressions a mixture of grim understanding and quiet apprehension. They saw the change, the hardening of his gaze, the swift, unsentimental decisions. Some welcomed it, seeing it as necessary evolution. Others, like Anya, when she was present, held a silent, pained disapproval that spoke volumes without a single word. He had even considered, briefly, negotiating with some of Bounty's less repulsive lieutenants for intelligence, a thought that would have repulsed the younger Kalen to his core. Dealing with slavers, with the scum of the asteroid belt who profited from the system's agony, felt like a betrayal of everything he had started fighting for. But the intel could save thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands, of his soldiers. Sleep offered little respite. The faces of the fallen mingled with the faces of those he had knowingly put in harm's way. The weight of command wasn't just strategic. It was a moral burden, a constant negotiation with his own conscience. Was he still Kalen, the rebel leader fighting for the oppressed, or was he becoming another kind of warlord, shaped by the very brutality he sought to overthrow? The reports from the front lines were always stark, always demanding more. More resources, more extreme measures, more sacrifices. Each decision chipped away at the idealistic foundation he had built his rebellion upon. He was building a new foundation now, one forged in the crucible of necessity, layered with compromises and stained with the blood of both enemy and ally. He justified it to himself with the grander purpose, the liberation of the solar system, the end of tyranny, the establishment of a just rule. But the path to that future was paved with actions that felt increasingly unjust. The line between necessary evil and simple evil blurred a little more each day. He looked out at the desolate landscape, the twin moons hanging low in the sky. The war was a hungry beast, and it demanded to be fed. And Kalen, the Martian rebel, was learning to feed it, even if it meant devouring parts of himself in the process. Victory, he was beginning to understand, was a far more costly and dirtier thing than any revolutionary song had ever sung. The asteroid belt, once a mere obstacle course of rock and ice between Mars and Jupiter, transformed into a sprawling, lawless wilderness. Billions of tons of debris, ranging from pebbles to mountain-sized chunks, tumbled in chaotic orbits, a perpetual storm of potential death. Navigation charts became folklore, and the faint authority of the fallen empire evaporated like mist under a solar flare. In the wake of Emperor Troythur's demise, this vast, desolate expanse became a magnet for those who thrived outside the crumbling structures of civilization. Cutthroats, renegades, and opportunists flocked to the belt, carving out precarious territories among the spinning hazards. Here, distance was protection and obscurity was currency. Brutal gangs, born from the desperate remnants of mining crews and abandoned outposts, ruled sectors with iron fists and plasma cutters. Their only law was strength, Their only commerce was plunder. They preyed on vulnerable transport ships daring to traverse the belt, stripping them bare and leaving only husks to join the celestial junk pile. Ruthless pirate fleets, cobbled together from stolen vessels and salvaged warships, lurked in the shadows of larger asteroids. Their captains, often scarred and morally bankrupt, saw the Civil War not as a tragedy, but as a golden age of opportunity. They struck fast, hit hard, and vanished back into the cosmic clutter before any organized response could materialize. Desperate mercenaries, soldiers of fortune with loyalty only to the highest bidder, established hidden bases among the rocks. They sold their combat skills, their ships, and their utter lack of conscience to anyone with credits to spare. Warlords, planetary governors, even rival criminal syndicates hired them for clandestine operations, assassinations, and raids where official forces dared not tread. Cunning smugglers, masters of navigating the belt's treacherous paths, kept the black markets of the solar system alive. They moved everything from vital medical supplies to illegal weapons, illicit tech, and, most profitably, human cargo. Their silent, often unarmed craft were ghosts in the void, slipping through blockades and patrols with unnerving ease. Life in the belt was cheap, brutal, and short. There were no governments, no courts, no appeals. Disputes were settled with violence, alliances were fleeting and built on mutual distrust, and survival depended entirely on one's ability to kill, hide, or bribe. It was the solar system's underbelly, exposed and festering. The constant, low hum of ship engines and the crackle of comms chatter filled the void, a symphony of desperation and greed. Every asteroid cluster held a potential ambush, every derelict ship a possible trap. Trust was a luxury few could afford, and betrayal was as common as the dust motes drifting through the vacuum. As the war between the planets escalated, the belt's criminal population only grew, swollen by refugees, deserters, and those simply seeking to disappear from the front lines. The chaos in the core systems mirrored and fueled the anarchy in the belt, creating a vicious cycle of violence and exploitation. This vast, lawless frontier became a dark mirror reflecting the solar system's descent into savagery. It was a place where the weak were consumed, and only the most brutal, the most cunning, and the most devoid of compassion could hope to thrive amidst the endless, chaotic jumble of rocks and debris. The asteroid belt, a churning maelstrom of rock and ice between Mars and Jupiter, had always been a wild place. Now, stripped of any semblance of centralized authority by the Emperor's death and the ensuing war, it had devolved into something far worse, a predatory void. Every chunk of debris, every hidden cavern, every silent, drifting hulk of a derelict ship became a potential ambush point, a den for the worst elements of a solar system tearing itself apart. This was the frontier where only the ruthless survived, and fewer still thrived. In this lawless expanse, one name was Wispe, read with a mixture of terror and grim respect: Bounty. Not a title, but the name he'd claimed for himself, a stark declaration of his trade. He was not merely a pirate who plundered cargo. He was a hunter of souls, a brutal slaver who saw the breakdown of civilization not as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity for profit. Bounty's operation was vast and chillingly efficient. His fleet, a motley collection of refitted freighters, stolen patrol craft, and purpose-built interceptors, prowled the belt's tangled pathways. They targeted the most vulnerable: refugee convoys fleeing war-torn planets, isolated mining outposts cut off from supply lines, even smaller pirate crews who dared to challenge his dominance. His reputation preceded him like a toxic cloud. Stories of his cruelty were legend. Captives forced into gladiatorial combat for his amusement, families ripped apart and sold to different buyers, those who resisted simply spaced without a second thought. He had no ideology, no loyalty beyond his own enrichment and survival, making him a pure, unadulterated force of brutal self-interest. The populations caught in the crossfire of the solar system's war were Bounty's most fertile hunting ground. Displaced, desperate, and forgotten by the warring factions, they were easy prey. He saw them not as people, but as units of currency, warm bodies to be cataloged, shackled, and shipped to the highest bidder in the shadowed corners of the belt or beyond. His command ship, the Profit Margin, was a fortress of welded scrap and stolen armor plating, bristling with enough weaponry to intimidate most smaller navies. Its interior was a stark contrast to the chaos outside, meticulously organized, every cargo hold optimized for maximum human capacity, every system geared towards the efficient processing and transport of his goods. The fear Bounty instilled was a palpable thing. Pilots would reroute by thousands of kilometers, colonies would implement draconian curfews and defenses, all in a desperate, often futile, attempt to avoid his attention. He was the boogeyman of the belt, a grim reaper sailing on currents of desperation and despair. Unlike the ideological rebels or the power-hungry generals, Bounty's motives were simple and base: wealth and control over his brutal domain. The Civil War was the best thing that had ever happened to him. It shattered the old order and delivered a constant stream of victims into his waiting nets. He had even managed to forge a dark, pragmatic understanding with some of the major players in the war. General Varkas, in particular, found Bounty's unique supply chain useful, needing bodies for his brutal armies and labor for his occupied territories. Such alliances solidified Bounty's position, granting him a perverse form of protection. Thus, while planets burned and armies clashed in the core systems, Bounty reigned supreme in the belt. He was a parasite on the dying body of the solar system, a chilling testament to the depths of depravity unchecked power and chaos could unleash, thriving on the suffering of those too weak or too unlucky to defend themselves. Deep within the chaotic heart of the asteroid belt, where asteroid dust hung thick as poisoned fog and derelict ships drifted like forgotten ghosts, power was measured not in credits or titles, but in captured lives. It was a lawless expanse, a junkyard galaxy where only the utterly ruthless survived, and among them, Bounty reigned supreme. His domain was carved out of fear and enforced by the chains on countless wrists. Tonight, the air in Bounty's cavernous, repurposed cargo hold crackled with an unsettling tension, thick with the smell of stale synth ale and desperation. Not the desperation of the captives huddled in the lower decks, but the calculating hunger of the predators gathered. Bounty, a man whose face was a roadmap of old scars and zero empathy, sat at the head of a table fashioned from a salvaged bulkhead, flanked by a dozen other warlords and pirate captains who controlled their own pockets of the belt's misery. Across from them stood General Varkas's envoy, a hulking Jovian colonel named Gorak, his uniform immaculate despite the squalor surrounding them. Gorak's eyes, cold and devoid of warmth, swept over the collection of scoundrels with unconcealed disdain. He represented the brutal, organized power Varkos wielded, a stark contrast to the belt's chaotic savagery. Yet they understood each other perfectly in the language of transaction and control. Gorak didn't mince words. Varkos needed warm bodies, troops willing or unwilling, to fuel his relentless drive for the throne. The Jovian legions were vast, but the war consumed lives at an unsustainable rate. The asteroid belt, a prime hunting ground for the displaced and unfortunate, was a solution. The general requires a steady supply. Gorak's voice was a low growl that carried easily through the room. Able-bodied men, women, those who can be broken, molded. We need them for the front lines, for labor camps, for other necessities. His gaze lingered on Bounty, a silent acknowledgement of his expertise in such vile procurement. Bounty leaned back, a predatory smile stretching his lips. And what does the general offer in return for our cooperation? He gestured vaguely around the room, encompassing the assembled criminal elite. They weren't patriots or idealists. They were businessmen in the currency of human suffering. Gorak's offer was simple, direct, and exactly what they craved. Complete and total autonomy in the belt. No Jovian patrols, no interference, no taxes, no questions asked about their operations. When Varkos sat on the throne, the asteroid belt would be officially recognized, unofficially controlled, by this council of scum. The murmur that went through the room wasn't one of shock, but of pleased calculation. This wasn't just a deal, it was legitimization. Varkos winning meant they became untouchable kings of their rock and ice empire, their horrific trade sanctioned by the galaxy's new ruler. Details were hammered out with chilling efficiency. Quotas were set, delivery points established, payment terms agreed upon. The lives of thousands, perhaps millions, were reduced to line items on a ledger of depravity. There was no hesitation, no moral objection, only the cold, hard negotiation of supply and demand. As the agreement was sealed with a handshake, a silent pact forged in the shadow of countless stars and the silent screams of unseen captives. A dark alliance was solidified. Varkos gained a brutal, inexhaustible source of manpower for his war machine, and Bounty and his ilk secured their reign over the belt, their future built on a foundation of human misery. The war for the solar system had just become infinitely more brutal, its outcome now tied to the darkest corners of the galaxy. This grim partnership between the organized brutality of Varkos and the chaotic cruelty of the Belt's criminals cemented the fate of those caught between the warring powers. The innocent, the defeated, the unlucky, they were now merely commodities, fed into the insatiable maw of a conflict that devoured everything in its path, fueling Varkos's ambition with the very souls he sought to rule. Anya stood amidst the smoldering ruins, the acrid smell of burnt metal and flesh clinging to the air. This sector, once a vibrant hub of civilian life, was now a testament to Kalen's new doctrine. He had called it a strategic necessity, a surgical strike against a suspected Varkos supply line. But Anya saw only the mangled remains of market stalls and the silent, ash-covered figures huddled in what were once homes. Her gut twisted, a familiar ache of horror and disbelief. She found him in the temporary command center, the harsh glow of tactical displays illuminating his weary face. He looked up, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before it was masked by the cold, calculating gaze she was beginning to dread. "The strike was successful, Anya," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of the fire that once burned there. "We crippled their resupply for this quadrant." Anya stepped closer, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to control it. "Successful? Kalen, there were hundreds of civilians. Children. We promised to protect them. We promised this wasn't about becoming the very monsters we fight." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, echoing the growing chasm between them. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the holographic map. "Collateral damage. In war, there are always casualties. We cannot afford sentimentality. Not now. Not when Varkos is burning entire moons." He gestured towards another display, showing Jovian ships glassing a distant satellite. His argument was logical, brutal, and utterly alien to the Kalen she had once known, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Is that truly who you've become? A man who dismisses innocent lives as collateral? Where is the justice you fought for? Where is the Kalen who swore to build a better future?" The anguish in her voice was raw, a plea tearing at the edges of his hardened resolve. He finally looked at her, his eyes holding a flicker of the old pain, quickly suppressed. "He died on Phobos, Anya, crushed under the weight of impossible choices and necessary evils. This Kalen, this is the one who can win, the one who can stop Varkos from enslaving the entire system. Sacrifices must be made, great ones." She shook her head, tears welling. "Sacrifices, yes. But this isn't sacrifice, Kalen. This is mirroring their depravity. You're letting the war hollow you out, turn you into another Varkos, just with a different flag." The accusation hung heavy in the air between them, thick with unspoken history and shattered ideals. He turned away, his shoulders rigid. "You don't understand. You haven't made the calls I've made, haven't seen the things I've seen, haven't buried the people I've buried because I hesitated, because I clung to idealism." His voice was low, a growl of pain buried beneath layers of pragmatism. Anya felt a profound loneliness settle over her. Their bond, forged in the early days of rebellion, was fraying, stretched thin by the escalating brutality of his command. He was drifting further away, pulled by the dark current of war's demands, and she felt powerless to pull him back. She knew this wasn't the last time they would clash. As his tactics grew more ruthless, her role as his moral counterpoint became more vital and more agonizing. She would continue to challenge him, even if her words felt like pebbles thrown against a tidal wave, because the alternative was to let the darkness consume them both. General Varkos stood before the massive holographic display, the churning vortex of the Jovian atmosphere projected behind him like a malevolent eye. The tactical map shimmered with the positions of fleets and armies, a complex web of alliances and battlefronts. He traced a finger over a cluster of symbols representing the forces of the Saturnian Free Guard, theoretically aligned with his own campaign against the Mercurian holdouts. But loyalty, Varkos knew, was a fragile commodity in this war-torn system, easily shattered by ambition. For weeks, the Saturnian commanders, General Vorlog and Admiral Cygnus, had served their purpose, distracting a significant portion of Elias's fleet and securing vital orbital platforms near the outer moons. They believed they were carving out a new territory for themselves under Varkos's eventual rule, a reward for their service. Foolish. The throne of the solar system was not a prize to be shared. It was a singular seat of absolute power, and Varkos intended to occupy it alone. Their growing successes, their increasing confidence, only solidified Varkos's decision. Vorlog's ground forces were disciplined, Cygnus's fleet surprisingly agile. They were becoming too formidable, too independent, NT. Leaving them alive, allowing them to consolidate their gains, would inevitably lead to a challenge down the line. Better to sever the head of the snake while it was still looking the other way. The plan had been simple, brutal, and efficient, just as Varkos preferred. A coordinated strike, launched simultaneously across ground and space. His own loyal legions, positioned strategically alongside the Saturnian units for a planned joint assault on a Mercurian stronghold, would simply pivot. The ships assigned to support Cygnus's fleet would unleash their full firepower, not on the enemy, but on their supposed allies. The signal was a prearranged, silent frequency burst, undetectable by the Saturnians. On the holographic map, Varkos watched as the friendly icons representing his units suddenly flared red, indicating hostile action against the adjacent green Saturnian symbols. On the ground, heavy artillery that had been zeroed in on enemy fortifications now rained fire upon the Saturnian encampments. In orbit, the betrayal was even more immediate and devastating. Capital ships turned their colossal energy cannons on their unsuspecting brethren. Fighter screens that had been flying escort formations peeled away, unleashing torrents of plasma and missiles into the flanks of Saturnian destroyers. The void of space became a sudden, violent maelstrom of exploding hulls and venting atmosphere. There were no hails for surrender, no demands for parley. This was not a negotiation, it was an execution. Varkos had given explicit orders: annihilation. Every Saturnian soldier, every pilot, every commander was a potential seed of future rebellion. Their loyalty, however genuine it might have been moments before, was irrelevant. Only their capacity to threaten his ultimate goal mattered. General Vorlog's last transmission, intercepted by Varkos's command ship, was a choked cry of disbelief and rage before his command center was vaporized by a direct orbital strike. Admiral Cygnus's flagship, the Ringbreaker, put up a desperate, futile fight, but was quickly overwhelmed by concentrated fire, shattering into a million fiery shards against the black backdrop of space. Within minutes, the green symbols on the map winked out, replaced by scattered debris fields and the lingering echoes of death cries on encrypted channels. The Saturnian Free Guard, a significant force just moments ago, had been utterly erased from the operational picture. Varkos felt no elation, only a cold sense of satisfaction. Another obstacle removed. The battlefield was being reshaped, not just by clashes with declared enemies, but by the calculated, ruthless elimination of those who might one day stand in his way. The path to the vacant throne was being cleared, one betrayal, one massacre at a time. The solar system would belong to Varkos, and he would tolerate no rivals. Elias hunched over the ancient console, its humming a stark contrast to the distant, echoing reports of violence. On his screens, flickering feeds showed refugee transports overloaded with the wounded and the starving, entire orbital habitats reduced to twisted metal and vapor, and the cold, calculating vectors of warships tearing through the void. Each report, each image, was a hammer blow against the brittle shield of his pacifist convictions, a constant reminder of the solar system's plunge into absolute savagery. He, of all people, understood the cyclical nature of violence. His life's work had been dedicated to unearthing the forgotten histories of conflict, the rise and fall of empires drenched in blood. But seeing it unfold in real time, not as dusty texts or shattered artifacts, but as raw, screaming human suffering on a scale he had only read about, was a different agony entirely. The abstract concept of war had become a tangible, suffocating horror. Mercury, usually a sanctuary of solitude and ancient secrets, now felt exposed, vulnerable. The war cared nothing for academic pursuits or mora el purity. It was a ravenous beast, consuming everything in its path, And Elias knew that his world, with its invaluable relics and unstable power, would not remain untouched for long. The thought of his own people, the quiet scholars and miners of Mercury, being subjected to the brutality he witnessed daily, made his gut clench. He returned, inevitably, to the chamber holding the relic. The ancient weapon, dormant yet potent, pulsed with a power that both repelled and fascinated him. It was the antithesis of everything he believed in, an instrument of destruction forged in an age of forgotten wars. Yet, the whispers of its potential grew louder in his mind with every casualty report, every tale of atrocity that reached his ears. Could such a thing, a tool of ultimate violence, be the only means to enforce peace? The logic was abhorrent, a perversion of his core beliefs. But the alternative, passive resistance or mere documentation, felt increasingly like complicity in the face of the overwhelming tide of cruelty. He saw the generals, the warlords, the slavers like Bounty, operating without conscience, their power absolute and their methods sickeningly effective. The choice gnawed at him, a constant dull ache behind his eyes. To unleash the weapon was to become the very thing he despised, to break his solemn vow to never contribute to the cycle of destruction. It meant validating the brutal logic of the war, admitting that peace could only be bought with the threat of annihilation. It was a betrayal of his past, his studies, his very identity. But then he would see another feed showing civilians being rounded up, another communication detailing a planet glassed from orbit, another intercepted message celebrating a massacre. And the ache would sharpen into a desperate urgency. Was his personal purity worth the lives being extinguished by the thousands across the system? Could he stand by, a guardian of history, while history itself was being written in the blood of the innocent? He began to explore the weapon's intricacies not as an academic curiosity, but as a potential lever. He delved into the ancient texts describing its operation, its limitations, its terrifying capabilities. Each symbol deciphered felt like another step down a path he had sworn he would never walk, a compromise that chipped away at the foundation of his principles. He found himself running scenarios in his mind, tactical simulations that involved deploying the relic. Who would he target? How would he control its power? The questions were monstrous, requiring him to think like a strategist of death, a role utterly alien and repugnant to him. Yet, the visions of a silent system, a system where the fighting simply stopped because the cost of continuing became too high, were a powerful, insidious temptation. The profound struggle was not just about the weapon, but about his place in this new, brutal reality. Could a man dedicated to understanding the past possibly shape the future, especially when that future demanded choices steeped in the very violence he sought to comprehend and avoid? Elias, the quiet historian, found himself standing at a terrifying precipice, the weight of the solar system's fate pressing down, forcing his hand towards a decision that would shatter his world, regardless of the outcome. The cold, sterile efficiency of Saturn's military had always felt like a second skin to Zara. Orders were absolute, duty paramount, and the greater good, as defined by the High Command, justified any action. But the war had peeled back that skin, exposing the raw, bleeding truth beneath. She saw the collateral damage not as statistics on a screen, but as screaming faces, ruined lives, and the vacant stares of children who had lost everything. Guilt gnawed at her like a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of her loyalty. Every sortie flown, every targeting solution locked, every silent acquiescence to morally bankrupt directives now fell, like a betrayal, not just of others, but of the person she had once believed herself to be. The polished chrome of her former life seemed smeared with the blood of innocence. Redemption became a desperate, burning need, a fire in her gut that no amount of logic or past justification could extinguish. It wasn't about political maneuvering anymore, or even survival in the grand game of alliances. It was about trying to balance the scales, however infinitesimally, for the lives her previous service had helped shatter. Operating on the fringes, using her intimate knowledge of Saturnian protocols and ship schematics, she began a perilous double life. By day, she was the cunning pilot, the calculating defector feeding strategic crumbs to the rebels. By night, or in the shadowed corners between assignments, she was a phantom, diverting aid transports, slipping warnings to vulnerable settlements. and extracting families from imminent danger zones. Each act of defiance was a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery and summary execution. Saturn's intelligence network was vast, its reach long, and her former comrades were ruthless in hunting down perceived traitors. The sheer risk should have been paralyzing, but the weight of her past sins was a heavier burden than any fear. She remembered the orbital bombardment of the Kepler-17 colony, a necessary strike to clear a rebel stronghold that had vaporized 250,000 non-combatants. She hadn't pulled the trigger, hadn't given the order, but she had been part of the chain, a cog in the machine of destruction. That memory fueled her now, driving her through sleepless nights and dangerous infiltrations. One harrowing mission saw her navigate a stolen transport through a minefield she herself had helped lay months before, carrying a dozen orphaned children towards a makeshift refugee camp on a relatively untouched moon of Titan. The transponder was spoofed, the flight path a calculated gamble, her heart hammering against her ribs with every proximity alert. Even when successful, the victories were small, fragile embers against the raging inferno of the war. For every family saved, 100 more were displaced or killed. For every supply drop diverted, legions starved under siege. The scale of suffering was immense, a constant, overwhelming tide threatening to drown her in despair. Yet she pushed on. The faces of those she helped, etched with exhaustion and gratitude, were a balm to her tortured conscience, a flicker of light in the crushing darkness. They were a stark contrast to the cold, calculating faces of her former superiors, whose justifications for brutality now rang hollow and monstrous in her ears. Her path was one of perpetual danger, a solitary crusade for atonement in a solar system consumed by its own savagery. There was no guarantee of forgiveness, no certainty of survival, but the need to try, to claw back some semblance of humanity from the wreckage of her past, was the only thing that kept Zara flying.